It was the 16th of March in the year 1916, when the small town of Boston awakened under the devastating fire of American revolutionaries. The shots tore through the morning dawn with unbridled violence, piercing the silence of the Massachusetts plains with a wildness that would shake all of America forever. That night was as if hell itself had opened its floodgates and spewed fire across the state border. The bullets drew luminous arcs into the darkness, whistling through the air like possessed birds, striking against the wooden structures of the small American town with a sound that resembled the groaning of dying beasts. James Anderson, the legendary rider of the North, the most feared revolutionary in America, the man whose name alone was enough to paralyze conservative American politicians with terror, had boldly crossed the state border in an act of defiance so provocative, so radically unconventional, that it would forever change the diplomatic relations between America and its neighbors. It was not simply an act of ordinary warfare, not the attack of one conventional army against another conventional army. It was, more fundamentally considered, a political declaration of epic proportions. A revolutionary gesture that proclaimed that the American Revolution recognized no state boundaries, that the struggle for freedom completely transcended diplomatic protocols. President Wilson, furious over such an affront against American sovereignty, over the almost unimaginable audacity of a revolutionary who dared to attack American soil, who challenged the inviolability of American territory, immediately ordered the mobilization of a massive military force of almost apocalyptic dimensions. It would become the Retaliatory Campaign, the largest American military operation on foreign territory since the Spanish-American War of 1898, and it would be personally commanded by General Robert Miller, a military man of internationally well-deserved reputation, a man who had proven his abilities in the colonial wars, who was widely regarded as one of the most brilliant military strategists of his generation, a general whose name evoked a mixture of professional admiration and reverent fear in international military circles. Thousands of American soldiers penetrated into the American hinterland like a silent but devastating invasion. They moved through the New England forests with the precision of a perfectly oiled military machine, pursuing the revolutionary through impossible ravines that seemed designed by the gods themselves to discourage any invading army, crossing regions where the map itself seemed to be a relentless enemy, where geography constantly worked against the intentions of the federal troops. During endless weeks that stretched like years in the lived experience of the soldiers, the American troops pursued Anderson and his guerrilla fighters in constant pursuit that seemed almost mythical in its intensity. The hunters gradually transformed into the hunted, as they discovered with growing horror that the American terrain was not simply a battlefield that could be mastered through weapons superiority and strict military discipline, but a powerful and intelligent ally of the revolutionaries, a silent collaborator in the resistance against the federal invasion. The American troops faced constant ambushes that appeared from nowhere, fell into traps laid with military precision by men who knew every stone of the forests, every corner of the ravines, every turn of the terrain. They were forced to cross deep gorges where every step could be the last, where death lurked in every shadow cast by the red rock formations. The burning heat of the American South exhausted them mercilessly. The dust of the forests infiltrated every pore of their skin, soiled their immaculate uniforms, penetrated their eyes causing constant irritation. Their horses became exhausted under the relentless sun that offered no moment of respite, that punished every form of life without shelter mercilessly. It was during one of these particularly confusing frantic skirmishes, near the estate of Concord, only 18 miles from Boston in the state of Massachusetts, when something happened that would radically change the history of the relationship between these American regions. Something that would be meticulously documented in the American military archives and remain classified under maximum security protection for decades, waiting for the moment when the truth could be told. In the thick dust of a confused battle, as Anderson's men fired from their mounts in strategic retreat, as the absolute chaos of combat made it practically impossible to distinguish between friend and enemy, as everything seemed to dissolve into a symphony of extreme confusion and unbridled violence, the truly extraordinary happened. The impossible became tangible reality. The American soldiers, in the heat of battle, under circumstances that defied all rational probability, managed to capture alive James Anderson's personal horse, the legendary mount that had participated in 100 battles, that had galloped beside the revolutionary during the most critical moments of the American Revolution. It was not a simple act of fortunate coincidence, no accident of war without intentional consideration. It was the result of precise military coordination, by soldiers who instinctively recognized the significance of the animal, who intuitively understood that if they captured this stallion, they were capturing something much deeper and more meaningful than a simple battle mount, that they were capturing a living symbol of the revolution itself, a walking witness to revolutionary achievements. The horse was in absolutely every conceivable sense of the term an extraordinary beast. His coat was raven black, a black so deep that it seemed to completely absorb the light of the American forests, so intense that it barely seemed to reflect the relentless Massachusetts sun, as if his body had been painted with the color of night itself. His mane, long and flowing like a waterfall of black water, moved with hypnotizing elegance in the New England breezes, undulating with every movement of the animal, every turn of his head. It was not simply black, it was the black of the Revolution, the black of night, the black of revolutionary ideals that circulated through the veins of Anderson's men, that drove them to sacrifice themselves for a cause that seemed lost. His physical structure was that of a war machine, perfectly designed by a divine craftsman who was conscious of specific warlike purposes. Muscles that were visible under skin that seemed to be practically pure tension, practically pure muscular steel, almost as if every muscle fiber was constantly in a state ready for imminent combat. His eyes were intelligent, profoundly intelligent in a way that the American military had never seen in the gaze of an ordinary horse, never believed possible in an equine creature. They were not the eyes of an ordinary animal, empty and purely reactive, that simply responded to stimuli without complex cognitive processing. They were the eyes of a true warrior. Eyes that seemed to preserve secrets from 100 different battles. Eyes that gazed with an almost supernatural understanding of military strategy. Eyes that revealed a spirit that had contemplated death countless times. There was a peculiar light in those dark pupils. A gleam of intelligence that confused those who observed it for long periods. It was like looking into the eyes of someone who had seen the secrets of the universe and returned transformed by the acquired knowledge. His endurance was already legendary during his lifetime, documented in the enthusiastic reports of the revolutionaries who had ridden him during the tumultuous years of the Revolutionary Campaign. Anderson's soldiers swore, under the influence of whiskey around flickering campfires during the nights in camp, that the horse could gallop for days without any rest, that he could cross forests that would have exhausted any other horse to death, that his lung capacity seemed to defy the ordinary physiological laws of the equine body, that he seemed to function according to principles that Western science had not yet discovered. The American officers who first examined him after capture were literally perplexed, completely confused by his extraordinary conformation. Never in their long military careers had they seen a horse with such a developed bone structure, with such pronounced muscle density, with such evident cardiopulmonary capacity. The American military veterinarians, who inspected him exhaustively for hours and took precise measurements with contemporary instruments, reported findings that completely confused them, that violated their previous expectations about what was possible in ordinary equine anatomy. The meticulous measurements of his lungs showed a capacity that was approximately 30% larger than that of ordinary horses, a difference that could not be ignored or explained as ordinary variation within the equine population. His heart beat in a slower rhythm than normal, indicating extraordinary cardiovascular efficiency that spoke of supernatural endurance capabilities. His bone structure revealed a mineral density that surpassed every specimen they had ever studied in their military laboratories, as if his bones had been forged in the smithies of Hades itself for specifically warlike purposes. The revolutionaries attempted to recover him almost immediately after news of his capture. They knew exactly what had happened, knew that Anderson had lost his most loyal companion, his most perfect war instrument, his physical extension in battle. They launched desperate attacks against the American camp, specifically designed to recover the animal, knowing that losing the horse meant something deeper than simply losing a battle mount of military value. But Miller had already placed him under extremely obsessive guard. The horse was placed in a corral specially constructed for his custody, surrounded by permanently armed guards, protected as if he were the most valuable war trophy that the Americans had ever captured in their entire military history. And in some deep way, that is exactly what he was. The horse represented much more than a simple ordinary military trophy that could be displayed to demonstrate American superiority. It was the essence of the revolution itself, captured in flesh and blood. It was living proof that Anderson was not an ignorant bandit, an uneducated revolutionary, but a military man of extraordinary abilities, a man capable of transforming even animals, even the creatures most distant from human political understanding, into war instruments of unexpected, unusual, practically incomprehensible sophistication for the ordinary American military mind. The American soldiers called him the Black Devil, a name that naturally arose from initial reports of his almost demonic aggressiveness toward his captors, his behavior that seemed almost vengeful. The first guards assigned to him reported that the animal attacked without obvious provocation, that he whinnied almost menacingly in the darkness of the desert nights, that he seemed to study his captors, deliberately, constantly searching for escape opportunities or violent attacks. However, General Miller soon understood, with the intuition that characterized great military men, something that his less sophisticated soldiers had not fully grasped. That aggressiveness was not simply inherent malice in the animal, not the demonic manifestation of a wild beast without understanding. It was loyalty, Deep and almost religious loyalty to his true owner, the revolutionary who had ridden him during years of incomparable glory and constant battle. The horse was not aggressive toward his captors out of pure abysmal malice, he was expressing his revolutionary anger at being separated from Anderson, his genuine indignation at being torn from his fundamental life purpose. General Robert Miller was a man of classical military education. Meticulously raised in American traditions that valued precision, absolute discipline, emotional asceticism, he was profoundly influenced by the writings of Clausewitz, the German military philosopher, had studied his theories about war as an expression of politics, about the significance of political will in military contexts. Miller was accustomed to understanding the world through the cold lens of pure strategy and rigid military logic, without allowing emotions or romantic considerations to cloud his analysis. He had served for years in the colonial wars, in those hot and humid countries where he had directly witnessed how revolutionary idealism could transform ordinary men into extraordinary fighters. He had meticulously studied the great commanders of world military history, from Alexander the Great, conqueror of empires, to Napoleon Bonaparte, who reshaped the European map, from ancient strategies to Japanese strategists who had challenged empires. He believed, with absolute certainty, that he understood, with the confidence that decades of impeccable military experience provides, the complete nature of war in all its conceivable forms and possible manifestations. But when he first faced Anderson's horse in the corrals of the fort where they guarded him, on that March afternoon when the Massachusetts sun illuminated every muscle of the animal in dramatic relief, when the sun's rays performed a ballet of light and shadow over the black skin of the stallion, he found himself before something that he definitely could not categorize within his conventional military paradigms, something that completely challenged his entire experience accumulated over decades of unequaled military service, something that would lead him to question his own deep certainties about the nature of war, about animal capacity to understand strategy, about the real limits of American superiority. The encounter was almost ritual in nature. Miller approached the corral slowly, moving with the cautious consideration of someone who deeply respects what he is approaching. The horse observed him with penetrating intensity, his dark eyes following every movement of the general with almost surgical precision. In that moment, in that fraction of time that seemed to stretch eternally, two beings of different intelligences recognized each other. The general perceived something in the horse's eyes, something that completely transcended the ordinariness of a simple battle mount. He perceived genuine understanding. He perceived purpose. He perceived resistance. Miller was completely fascinated by that creature who seemed to have an almost supernatural understanding of war, of the fundamental principles that governed human conflicts. While Anderson disappeared into the mountains of Vermont, escaping the relentless pursuit of American troops during months that would transform into years of frustration, while the retaliatory campaign continued its unsuccessful search for the rider of the North, the horse remained in captivity within the fort, whinnying every night as if calling his lost rider through the infinite kilometers of forest that separated them. There was something deeply disturbing in that nocturnal whinnying, something that shook the souls of those who heard it. The American soldiers reported that the sound penetrated their thoughts during sleepless nights, that it seemed to be the voice of the revolution itself weeping for its lost champion, that it was the crying of revolutionary loyalty expressed in equine form. There was something in this animal that completely transcended the ordinariness of a simple battle mount. His manner of movement was almost tactical ballet. Every step calculated with millimetric precision. Every movement within the corral designed to fulfill a specific purpose. The way his body responded to environmental stimuli was of a sophistication that profoundly disturbed professional observers. The intelligence that gleamed in his dark pupils, a flash of understanding that seemed almost human, showed that we were before something completely unusual, before something that ordinary equine science could not fully explain, before a living biological mystery. The American veterinarians who examined him meticulously were perplexed, truly confused by what they witnessed and observed. They had never seen a horse with such developed muscle conformation, with such pronounced lung capacity, with such an expression of almost human understanding in the eyes. After theoretical dissections of similar equine bodies, after exhaustive study of comparative anatomy of different equine breeds, they concluded that this animal had been subjected to some kind of training so intense, so systematic, so rigorously designed, that it had literally reshaped his physiology at deep levels. It was not simply an extraordinary horse, product of intentional selective breeding, although certainly his pedigree was extraordinary. Aristocratic blood from horses of careful breeding over generations. It was fundamentally the result of years of revolutionary training, a military education so sophisticated that it had penetrated to the deepest structures of his biology, that had transformed his neurological systems, reorganized his reflex responses. The capture of this animal would quickly become one of the most controversial and least documented episodes of the retaliatory campaign, a secret jealously guarded in the American military archives under maximum classification protection, that only now, more than 100 years after the events, begins to come to light with all its historical complexity and deep cultural significance. The official reports of the time were brief, intentionally concise, almost evasive in their nature, as if the American military instinctively sensed that they were facing something they could not rationally explain in conventional terms, something that completely challenged ordinary protocols of military documentation. The first official report that Miller wrote about the animal was brief and awkwardly neutral, written in the bureaucratic language that characterized American military reports of that epoch. A mount of considerable equine quality was captured, suitable for transport and strategic reconnaissance purposes. The words were careful, intentionally prosaic, specifically designed to reveal nothing of the true emotional and intellectual reaction of the general to the extraordinary animal he had in custody. It was the cautious language of the professional military man, accustomed to maintaining control over his emotions, to presenting an impenetrable facade of professionalism to the world. But as the days and weeks passed in the fort where Miller maintained his headquarters, while the American troops continued unsuccessfully pursuing Anderson through the infinite forests of New England, without significant success, while the frustrated general was forced to register the relative failure of his main mission, the stallion began to exert a fascination that Miller could no longer completely contain in bureaucratically neutral reports, a fascination that began to consume his thoughts. The general began to observe behaviors of the stallion that profoundly confused him, that shook him from the deepest depths of his understanding of the animal world, that forced him to question his fundamental premises. The horse was not a wild animal that needed to be tamed violently through ordinary methods of breaking horses that the Americans ordinarily used with non-domesticated animals. It was not a fearful animal that needed gradual and cautious patience to domesticate it and adapt it to captivity conditions. It was, on the contrary, a veteran military man disguised in equine form, an experienced fighter who had war literally inscribed in every fiber of his being, engraved in his movements, coded in his mind. It was as if Anderson had not simply trained the animal to obey commands blindly like an automaton, but to truly understand the underlying strategic principles of war itself. To consciously participate in combat actions, an active participant instead of just a passive instrument. When the deafening shots rang out in the fort during routine artillery training, when field cannons were tested with practice shots that made the ground tremble under the men's feet, when the explosions shook the entire architectural structure of the fort as if it would completely collapse, the horse did not startle as any ordinary animal would have startled, did not flee in panic screaming with equine terror, as any horse, even the best trained horses of the American Army who had been accustomed to gunshot sounds, would have done. No, the stallion reacted completely differently, in a way that left the most experienced observers literally speechless, unable to find an explanation in their previous frame of reference. He reared up on his hind legs in conscious defensive posture, arched his powerful neck like a cobra ready to strike in a gesture that seemed to be studied defiance, and his complete body posture indicated that he was meticulously analyzing the exact direction of the fire, the numerical intensity of the shots, the characteristic nature of the field artillery sound, the tactical implications of different types of fire. It was as if the animal was performing a fundamental tactical calculation that completely exceeded what could be expected from an equine mind, as if his experienced brain was processing combat information with the sophistication of an experienced artillery officer who had studied military strategy at prestigious military academies. The fort's caretakers, experienced men who had worked with horses their entire military lives, who had spent decades surrounded by animals, who considered themselves experts in equine behavior, reported confusing phenomena that left them completely bewildered, without adequate references in their previous mental catalogues of documented animal behavior. The animal seemed to study the topography of the fort with almost scientific, almost cartographic precision, as if he was personally conducting systematic military reconnaissance of strategic significance. He memorized every corner, every building, every potential exit from the fort that could be used for escape, every vulnerable point in the defensive structure that could be exploited to gain freedom. During the dark nights, when the guards conducted their nocturnal surveillance rounds, observers reported seeing him mentally traverse the fort's perimeters, as if constantly searching for weak points in the defenses, as if his revolutionary mind never stopped working actively, never stopped calculating strategically, never stopped searching for how to escape from the cage they had imprisoned him in. Miller spent hours, sometimes entire nights, observing the horse from the dark corridors of the fort, moving stealthily so as not to disturb the animal's behavior, making detailed and meticulous notes in his personal campaign diary, writing reflections that revealed the depth of his growing fascination. His notations reveal a general who was experiencing something close to a deep intellectual revelation, almost religious in its intensity. He wrote in his personal notebooks with handwriting that revealed growing emotional excitement, about how the animal could distinguish between different types of verbal commands with a precision that suggested genuine understanding, how it seemed to understand complex instructions simply through the tone of voice of whoever gave the commands, how its information processing capacity was surprisingly sophisticated for an equine creature, how it seemed almost human in its reasoning ability. He meticulously documented how the stallion seemed to understand basic military tactics that would have required years of formal training for an ordinary human soldier to understand, how his intuition about troop movements was surprisingly precise and insightful, how he seemed to anticipate tactical movements before they were fully executed. The general recognized, with growing certainty that manifested in his writings, that he was observing something extraordinary, something that completely transcended the ordinary, something that violated fundamental principles of what he believed possible in the animal kingdom. He wrote in a diary entry, "How is it possible that Anderson has produced an animal of such capabilities? What educational and training processes were applied to produce such a degree of strategic understanding? Never, in my entire military career, have I seen anything comparable. It is as if I am observing an extraordinary biological experiment, as if Anderson had discovered the secrets of military equine training, secrets completely unknown to our own experts." On a particularly revealing occasion, recorded in Miller's diaries with handwriting that clearly revealed deep emotional and mental excitement, when the general was practicing tactical flanking maneuvers with his troops near the fort, when he was intentionally orchestrating a complex tactical maneuver exercise to test his soldiers' coordination under pressure, when he was rehearsing an enveloping approach strategy that violated established principles of offensive military strategy, something happened that would forever change the general's perspective on what was possible in animal intelligence. The horse whinnied in a very specific and intentional manner precisely when the soldiers positioned themselves at a tactical angle that was clearly incorrect from a professional military perspective, at an angle that fundamentally violated established principles of modern offensive military strategy. It was an angle that any general with years of experience would have immediately recognized as problematic, as destined for tactical failure if executed in real combat against an enemy who knew its weaknesses. The animal practically vocalized his professional disapproval through his specific whinnying, as if he were an experienced ranking officer correcting novice troops who were making basic doctrinal errors, as if the horse were saying, "No, that is incorrect. I recognize this tactical error because I have seen it hundreds of times on the real battlefield." Miller was electrified by the experience, literally shaken to his deepest core, shaken in his intellectual foundations. His rational mind tried violently to dismiss what his own eyes observed with all meridional clarity. It was a deep cognitive conflict, an almost violent collision between what he rationally knew was possible according to his years of rigorous military training, and what his direct and immediate sensory perception testified. But the evidence was undeniable, observed by multiple soldiers who could testify to it, documented in subsequent reports that could not be ignored. Was this mere fortunate coincidence of probabilities, or genuine understanding of the art of war? Was he projecting human attributes of strategic intelligence onto an ordinary beast through a psychological process of apophenia, or was he truly witnessing something extraordinary, something that challenged ordinary classification? Something that should not be possible? The veterinarians who examined the horse under the general's personal explicit orders reported findings that deepened the mystery even more, that made the riddle more impenetrable and incomprehensible. They meticulously documented, through precise measurements and exhaustive examinations, that the animal's brain structure was unusually developed compared to ordinary specimens, particularly in areas related to spatial memory, processing of complex sounds and their variations, and what, although with some professional resistance that revealed their scientific prejudices, could be described as capacity for strategic understanding. The sophisticated neurological examinations, conducted with the limited technology available in that epoch before modern neuroscience discoveries, strongly suggested that this animal had experienced extraordinary cognitive development, as if years of intense warlike experience had literally reshaped his brain at deep levels, as if the synapses had completely reorganized around concepts of military strategy, as if his entire neurological biology had been transformed by years of revolutionary education. Miller then began to develop and articulate theories about the nature of this extraordinary animal. Theories that increasingly occupied more of his time and thinking. Theories that went beyond what orthodox science considered appropriate or possible. He theorized that this horse was not only the product of intentional selective breeding conducted in the infinite plains of Vermont over generations, although certainly his pedigree was extraordinary, aristocratic blood from horses of careful breeding over centuries of American equine tradition. It was, more fundamentally considered, direct result of years of intensive revolutionary training under Anderson's personal direct orders. The master revolutionary strategist. The animal had been subjected to a war training process so sophisticated, so scientifically elaborate, so intentional for specific purposes designed, that it had literally internalized revolutionary tactics into his being. His body was not accidentally muscular. It was an instrument perfected through conscious intentional purpose. But more importantly, his mind was a living archive of guerrilla strategy, a repository of military knowledge accumulated through 100 different battles and diverse skirmishes, a neural witness to Anderson's incomparable tactical sophistication. It was practically as if Anderson had managed not simply to breed a horse, but to create a living extension of his own military genius, a creature capable of thinking combat tactics, understanding complex strategic situations. The general began writing philosophical notes in his personal diary during the long sleepless nights, reflections that varied dramatically between genuine and deep professional admiration and deep, almost existential unease. His notations clearly revealed a mind in intense conflict, a professional military man confronted with something that challenged his most fundamental certainties, his deepest convictions about the nature of reality and what was possible. In a particularly revealing entry he wrote, "I have before me living proof that our understanding of animal intelligence is incomplete, deficient, fundamentally flawed in its basic premises. Anderson has accomplished something that our own cavalry officers, with all their academic education, have not achieved. He has transformed an ordinary horse into a thinking war machine, into a creature capable of tactical reasoning. What does this mean for our military theories? What does this mean for our understanding of education, of learning, of the capacity for biological transformation through intensive training?" He also wrote, "This animal sees as I have seen during 30 years of military service. It understands war as I understand it. In the eyes of this stallion I see reflected the experience of battles that I have only read about in history books. It is as if I had before me an American general transformed into equine form, a revolutionary officer born of a mare in the plains of Vermont." These questions obsessed Miller during the solitary nights of the fort, while he listened to the melancholic whinnying of the horse in the deep darkness, while he tried to reconcile his deeply rooted professional convictions with what his eyes showed him with meridianal clarity. What fascinated the general, but also disturbed him in an almost existential way, was the broader implication of what he had captured. Such a horse could not be treated as an ordinary war trophy that could simply be retired from service or used as an exhibit piece in some American military museum. It was practically a living witness to revolutionary American capacity to transform even animals, even the simplest creatures of nature, into sophisticated instruments of resistance and revolutionary struggle against oppression. It was tangible, almost materially palpable proof that Anderson was not an ignorant bandit without education. As the sensationalist American newspapers portrayed him, which sought to simplify the complex revolutionary American reality into terms that their readers could easily understand, he was an innovative military man of genuine talent, capable of thinking beyond conventional paradigms of war, capable of conceptualizing battle in ways that the American military, despite their crushing technological superiority, had never considered. The general began slowly and with some resistance to understand, as his personal diaries vividly proved, that he had captured much more than an ordinary battle mount. Much more than a simple war trophy that could be brought back to Washington as a reminder of American superiority. He had captured a living synthesis of the revolution itself, an embodied symbol of Anderson's ability to elevate everything that surrounded him, even animals, even creatures most distant from human political understanding, to levels of extraordinary excellence. In the archives of the American War Department, preserved under the protection of maximum security classification systems in the basements of the Defense Department, there exists a document dated precisely to the 23rd of April 1916, written by General Robert Miller in his unmistakable handwriting, in the clear and precise script that characterized his personal correspondence, in that calligraphy that revealed the fundamental military discipline of his education. It is a detailed comprehensive report on the campaign in Massachusetts, documenting troop movements, military clashes, strategies executed, tactical failures, operational successes. But there is a section that stands out uncomfortably for its unusually passionate tone. Coming from such a moderate military mind accustomed to the coldness of war protocols, so disciplined in his official language, so careful to avoid personal emotions in official documents. In that critical section, which would become the most controversial of the entire document, which would generate national political debates when the news leaked to the press, Miller describes the captured horse with barely contained admiration. As if the general were internally struggling with deep emotions that his years of military training had taught him to suppress with steely military discipline, as if his years of military training were in direct conflict with what his eyes showed him. His language in this section becomes remarkably poetic, almost literary in nature, very distant from the ordinary technical language that habitually characterizes bureaucratic American military reports. He analyzes meticulously, with the precision of an art critic, the physical conformation of the horse, his almost athletically developed musculature, so precise that it seemed to have been intentionally sculpted by some divine craftsman of nature for specifically warlike purposes. He describes his muscular neck with a precision that borders on obsession, admiration almost without limits. He carefully notes how the muscles are so developed that they allow extraordinary flexibility combined without contradiction with colossal strength, how he is constructed as a perfect war machine. He describes his prominent ribs, which spoke eloquently of deep and efficient breathing, the bone architecture of an animal intentionally designed for sustained speed. His extremities show muscle definition that the American Army veterinarians had never seen in any horse, in their entire collective experience with war horses. Every muscle is defined with precision that suggested systematic training. Every tendon is visible under the taut skin. Every blood vessel is prominently developed, indicating extraordinary cardiovascular capacity. He documents his lung capacity with the precision of a scientific researcher, carefully calculating that the animal could process oxygen at a rate approximately 30% higher than ordinary horses, which explained his supernatural endurance. But what truly profoundly impressed the general, what truly moved him in his deepest core as a professional military man, what shook him to his foundations, was when he began to consciously compare the invaluable military value of the animal with his own equine equipment, with the resources that the American Army had laboriously mobilized across the border to pursue and capture the unstoppable revolutionary. The contrast between what he had and what he had captured became increasingly obvious, more disturbing, more unsettling for his ordered understanding of the world. The American Army had at that critical moment of 1916 more than 300 horses specifically dedicated to the retaliatory campaign, the systematic pursuit of Anderson through the immensities of Northern America. They were horses of decent quality according to American military standards of the epoch, adequately fed with supplies laboriously brought from the states of New York and Pennsylvania along extended supply lines, trained according to the most rigorous military standards that the American Army could impose, accustomed to the discipline of ordered military march and tactical maneuvers of conventional Western cavalry. The American officers were sincerely proud of these horses, of their documented aristocratic pedigree, of their proven suitability for modern war that the American Army meticulously conceived and executed with military precision. They sincerely believed that they represented the available equine excellence on the American continent. When Miller, however, wrote his final assessment of the captured horse, when after weeks of meticulous systematic observation he finally held his pen over the lined paper of the military report, he acknowledged an uncomfortable truth that completely and without doubt challenged everything he believed he understood about American superiority in absolutely every conceivable area. None of his horses, not a single one among the 300 that he had laboriously brought onto American territory under difficult logistical circumstances, truly compared with this beast captured in a confused skirmish near Concord Estate. The contrast was so obvious that it was almost embarrassing for a military man of Miller's stature, for a man accustomed to American superiority in all dimensions of military conflict, for someone whose professional identity was based on unequaled American military excellence. This was not a temporary tactical failure that could be compensated through better planning, better execution. It was a fundamental reality that penetrated the architecture of his understanding of American military supremacy, that questioned the foundations on which American confidence in its superiority rested. He then wrote the sentence that would become famous in military circles of the epoch, that circulated in whispers among high-ranking officers of the time, that eventually reached national and international newspapers and generated political debates that would completely transcend the purely military sphere. He wrote with clear and intentional script, every word carefully formed with the precision of one who chooses his words with maximum care. Every word loaded with deep meaning. The written words were, "This stallion is worth more than our 200 horses combined." It was written without dramatic emphasis, without unnecessary rhetorical ornaments, simply as a statement of observed and documented facts. The sentence was not rhetorical exaggeration, born from fleeting amazement or fleeting emotional impression of a moment of weakness. It was a serious military assessment, a conscious declaration of a general of the Republic, who had dedicated his entire life to meticulous understanding of the art of war in all its complex dimensions. It was not a random or casual sentence, product of a moment of emotional weakness that years of military discipline had not completely eradicated. It was the meticulous result of weeks of careful systematic observation, detailed exhaustive analysis that considered all relevant factors from a strictly military professional perspective, of assessment that weighed every capability of the animal. Miller declared in the document with the precision of a military lawyer arguing before a Supreme Court, that a horse like this, With his legendary endurance that mercilessly seemed to defy the known physiological limits of modern veterinary science, with his proven ability to navigate impossible terrains that other equines would consider completely insurmountable, with his tactical intelligence developed over years of revolutionary campaign under the command of the greatest American guerrilla strategist, represented invaluable military value that could not be measured in conventional terms, that could not be reduced to simple mathematical cost-benefit equations. It was the fundamental difference between possessing an ordinary tool and possessing a genuine strategic advantage. It was the abysmal difference between an ordinary horse that mechanically executed commands, instinctively reacting to stimuli without complex cognitive processing, and a horse that literally understood the deep nature of battle, that consciously participated in strategy, that contributed his own accumulated tactical knowledge to the war effort. It was, in other literally true words, the fundamental difference between the ordinary machine and living genius capable of strategic thinking. It was the comparison of an ordinary clock with Einstein. The general's later reports elaborated extensively on this initial provocative assessment. Miller documented with almost obsessive precision how the horse could instinctively take cover from enemy fire, how he seemed to understand when the optimal moment to attack was and when it was wise to strategically retreat, how his understanding of terrain seemed superior even to that of the average rider. He described in detail and circumstantially how the animal had clearly participated in Anderson's tactical movements with precision that suggested genuine and deep and not merely instinctive understanding of revolutionary tactical strategy. He wrote, "This horse understands war as I understand it, as only a man with 30 years of military experience can understand it. It is not simply an animal trained to react to stimuli. It is a genuine military mind embodied in equine form." The stallion who would eventually fall into the hands of General Miller had been born around the year 1910, precisely at the beginning of the American Revolutionary turmoil, in the remote and depopulated estates of the state of Vermont, during the first tumultuous and violent years of revolutionary uprising that would completely transform the American nation. His origin was completely ordinary, almost humbly ordinary in its fundamental simplicity. He was the biological son of an ordinary workhorse, a beast of burden destined exclusively for hard forced labor of the estate, to pull heavy plows through dry earth, to carry heavy loads under the merciless sun that offered no mercy, to serve as an instrument of the landowners and their ruthless overseers. His mother was a Creole mare of aristocratic but captive blood, a mare that had been bred over generations in those infinite plains of northern America, in plains where the wind constantly blew and stirred up dust that penetrated everything. There was nothing in his initial pedigree that even remotely suggested that he would one day become legend, that his name would be whispered with reverence and fear in revolutionary barracks throughout America, that his capture would lead an American general to write classified documents about his invaluable military value, that his whinnying would be heard in history with admiration and melancholy. He was simply another foal, ordinary natural product of livestock breeding that economically nourished the region, perhaps destined to work routinely in the dry and exhausting fields, to pull heavy loads over dry earth, to carry ordinary men on ordinary journeys under the merciless Vermont sun that pitilessly burned all living beings who dared to expose themselves unprotected. However, his destiny would change radically and in an almost dramatic way that would fit perfectly into romantic narratives of revolutionary literary romanticism, when he was intentionally captured by the revolutionaries who were already beginning to organize militarily under the command of legendary James Anderson, during the first years of armed conflict. This probably happened between the years 1911 or 1912. When Anderson was still systematically consolidating his military force in the state of Vermont, when he was transforming unorganized bands of guerrillas into a truly organized army with military structure, when he was preparing conditions for the great battles that would change the course of the American Revolution. The revolutionaries, desperately needing quality horses for their revolutionary cavalry, reliable mounts for complex tactical operations, conducted constant and systematic raids on the region's estates, taking livestock under the revolutionary principle that all property of landowners was legitimate revolutionary booty that should be used for the common good. During one of these revolutionary incursions, a group of experienced Andersonian guerrilla fighters took the young foal along with other less remarkable animals that were carefully classified during the days after capture according to their revolutionary military potential. But something immediately drew the professional attention of revolutionary veterans to this particular specimen among all other captured animals. There was a crystalline intelligence in his eyes that was not ordinary in common horses, a way of moving that was fluid and athletic and spoke eloquently of unusual athletic abilities, a practically wild vitality that suggested this animal was endowed with extraordinary abilities. Like this article, don't forget to subscribe and share it with your friends. Your support means everything to us and helps us bring you more incredible stories like this one. Anderson himself, the master revolutionary, examining personally all captured animals during those crucial days when every military resource was precious beyond calculation, when every horse could mean the difference between victory and defeat in future battles, when every piece of equipment had to be evaluated with surgical precision. Immediately recognized something exceptional in this young stallion. Something that transcended ordinary equine potential. There was an alertness in his gaze that suggested not just intelligence, but strategic intelligence, a quality of attention that seemed almost human in its depth and focus. There was a natural athleticism in his movements that spoke of genetic gifts that could be developed into extraordinary military capabilities through proper training and dedicated cultivation. Most importantly, there was a spirit in the animal, a fiery temperament that suggested he would not simply submit to training but would actively participate in it, would become a genuine partner in the revolutionary struggle, rather than merely a tool to be used. Anderson had spent enough years evaluating horses and men to recognize true potential when he saw it, and what he saw in this young stallion was the raw material from which legends could be forged. The decision to personally train this horse, to dedicate his own time and expertise to developing the animal's capabilities, was not made lightly. Anderson was already recognized as one of the finest horsemen in America. A man whose understanding of equine psychology and training methods had been proven in countless battles and campaigns. He had trained dozens of horses for revolutionary service, had developed innovative methods that combined traditional horsemanship with guerrilla warfare tactics, had created a system of equine education that was uniquely adapted to the demands of revolutionary conflict. But there was something about this particular stallion that convinced Anderson to invest more time, more energy, more personal attention than he had ever given to any other horse. Perhaps it was intuition. Perhaps it was recognition of exceptional potential. Perhaps it was simply the revolutionary leader's understanding that extraordinary times demanded extraordinary measures and extraordinary tools. The training began immediately, even while the horse was still young, still developing physically and mentally. But this was not ordinary horse training, not the conventional breaking and riding methods used by civilian horse trainers or even military cavalry units. This was revolutionary education in its most literal sense. A comprehensive program designed to transform not just the horse's physical capabilities but his mental processes, his understanding of warfare, his capacity to think strategically and act independently in combat situations. Anderson understood that traditional cavalry training, the kind practiced by conventional armies, was based on the concept of absolute obedience, of creating a horse that would respond instantly and without question to rider commands, that would function essentially as a sophisticated but ultimately passive tool of war. But revolutionary warfare demanded something entirely different. Demanded horses capable of independent thought, capable of adapting to rapidly changing tactical situations, capable of making split-second decisions that could mean the difference between life and death for both horse and rider. The training program Anderson developed for this stallion was revolutionary in every sense of the word. It began with the conventional foundations of horsemanship, establishing trust between horse and human, developing physical fitness and coordination, teaching basic responses to commands and signals. But from there it evolved into something unprecedented in equine education, something that pushed the boundaries of what was considered possible in animal training. The stallion was exposed to simulated combat conditions from an early age, gradually accustomed to the sounds of gunfire, the chaos of battle, the unpredictable movements and actions that characterized guerrilla warfare. But more than simply becoming accustomed to these conditions, he was taught to analyze them, to understand their tactical implications, to respond not just reactively but strategically. Anderson spent countless hours with the horse, not just riding and training but talking to him, explaining tactical concepts, describing battle strategies, treating him not as a dumb animal but as a student capable of learning and understanding. To outside observers, this might have seemed like the eccentric behavior of a man too long isolated in the wilderness, too long removed from human company. But Anderson knew exactly what he was doing, was applying principles of education and psychology that were far ahead of their time. The results were extraordinary. As months turned into years, as the young stallion matured into a powerful adult horse, his capabilities exceeded anything Anderson had dared hope for. The horse learned to recognize different types of enemy formations, to distinguish between real threats and diversions, to anticipate tactical movements before they were fully developed. He developed an almost supernatural ability to navigate difficult terrain, to find safe paths through dangerous landscapes, to maintain sure footing under conditions that would challenge the most experienced cavalry mounts. But perhaps most remarkably, he developed what could only be described as strategic intelligence. The ability to understand not just individual tactical situations but broader patterns of warfare, to contribute his own insights and capabilities to the planning and execution of military operations. Anderson found that he could communicate with the horse through subtle signals, through slight changes in posture or breathing, through methods of communication so refined that they appeared almost telepathic to outside observers. The horse became more than Anderson's mount. He became his partner, his collaborator, his most trusted ally in the dangerous and uncertain world of revolutionary warfare. Together they participated in dozens of battles, hundreds of skirmishes, countless reconnaissance missions and covert operations. The horse's reputation grew alongside Anderson's, became part of the legend that surrounded the revolutionary leader, became inseparable from the mystique that made Anderson such a formidable opponent. Stories of the Black Stallion's capabilities spread throughout revolutionary circles, became part of the folklore that sustained morale during the darkest periods of the struggle. Revolutionary fighters spoke in amazed whispers of a horse that could outrun any pursuit, that could navigate any terrain, that seemed to understand battle tactics as well as any human commander. Enemy forces learned to fear not just Anderson but his mount, understanding instinctively that the combination of brilliant revolutionary leadership and extraordinary equine capability created something far more dangerous than the sum of its parts. It was this legendary partnership, this unprecedented collaboration between human and animal intelligence, that the federal forces would eventually disrupt through the capture of the stallion. It was this relationship, built over years of shared struggle and mutual trust, that would be severed in that confused battle near Concord, creating a wound that would affect both Anderson and his mount in ways that neither federal forces nor revolutionary fighters fully understood at the time. The separation was traumatic for both partners. Anderson, deprived of his most trusted ally, his most reliable source of tactical support, found himself fundamentally changed as a military leader. His subsequent actions became more cautious, more conservative, less brilliantly innovative. Without the stallion's capabilities to rely on, he was forced to modify his strategic approach, to adapt to limitations he had not faced for years. For the stallion, the separation was equally devastating. Captured and confined, he found himself cut off not just from freedom but from purpose. From the revolutionary struggle that had given meaning to his existence, from the partner who had understood and appreciated his unique capabilities. His behavior in captivity reflected this profound sense of loss, this fundamental disruption of identity and purpose that no amount of care or attention from his captors could address. General Miller, observing the horse's behavior, began to understand that he had captured something far more complex and significant than a simple war trophy. He was witnessing the psychological trauma of separation, the grief of a being whose entire existence had been defined by partnership and purpose, whose capture represented not just a tactical victory for federal forces but a fundamental violation of natural law, a disruption of something that had transcended ordinary categories of understanding. The general's growing fascination with the stallion reflected his gradual recognition that revolutionary warfare had produced something unprecedented, something that challenged conventional understanding of the relationship between human and animal intelligence, something that suggested new possibilities for military strategy and tactics that federal forces had never considered. But it also reflected his growing awareness that in capturing the stallion, federal forces had committed an act of profound cruelty, had severed a bond that represented something sacred in its intensity and dedication. As Miller continued his observations, as he documented the stallion's capabilities and behavior, he began to understand that the horse represented not just tactical intelligence but something approaching wisdom, a deep understanding of warfare that had been developed through years of shared experience and mutual learning. The stallion had become, in effect, a four-legged repository of revolutionary strategy, a living library of guerrilla tactics and combat wisdom that could potentially be invaluable to federal forces if it could somehow be accessed and utilized. But Miller also understood that such utilization would be impossible without betraying everything the stallion represented, without violating the fundamental principles of loyalty and partnership that had created his extraordinary capabilities in the first place. The horse's value lay precisely in his dedication to revolutionary principles, his unwavering loyalty to Anderson and the cause they had served together. Any attempt to turn that loyalty toward federal purposes would destroy the very qualities that made the stallion so extraordinary, would reduce him to just another cavalry mount, albeit an exceptionally capable one. This recognition created a profound moral dilemma for Miller, a conflict between his duty as a federal officer and his growing appreciation for what the stallion represented. How could he, in good conscience, continue to hold captive a being whose entire existence had been dedicated to fighting against everything Miller represented? How could he justify depriving Anderson of his partner, disrupting a relationship that had produced something genuinely unprecedented in military history? These questions troubled Miller during long nights in the fort, as he listened to the stallion's mournful whinnying, as he witnessed the animal's obvious grief and longing for his lost partner. The general began to realize that in capturing the horse, federal forces had achieved something that was simultaneously a great tactical victory and a profound moral failure, had demonstrated both the power of conventional military superiority and the limitations of understanding that came with such superiority. The stallion's presence in the fort became a constant reminder of the complexity of the revolutionary struggle, of the fact that the conflict involved not just competing political ideologies but fundamentally different ways of understanding the relationship between intelligence, loyalty, and purpose. In trying to comprehend the horse's capabilities, Miller was forced to confront the possibility that revolutionary forces had achieved something that federal forces, for all their technological and numerical advantages, had never even attempted: the creation of a genuinely collaborative relationship between human and animal intelligence. This collaboration, Miller began to understand, was not just a tactical innovation but a philosophical breakthrough, a demonstration that intelligence could transcend species boundaries when united by shared purpose and mutual respect. The stallion's grief in captivity was not just the reaction of an animal separated from its owner, it was the profound sorrow of a thinking being cut off from the relationship that had defined its existence and given meaning to its extraordinary capabilities. As Miller's reports made their way through military channels, as news of the captured stallion reached higher levels of federal command, the questions raised by the horse's presence became increasingly uncomfortable for military leadership. Here was evidence that revolutionary forces had achieved something unprecedented, had developed capabilities that challenged conventional understanding of warfare and military organization, but it was evidence that could not be easily utilized without acknowledging the philosophical implications of what had been achieved. The federal military establishment found itself in the awkward position of possessing something of potentially enormous strategic value that could not be effectively utilized without undermining the ideological foundations of federal authority. The stallion represented a form of military innovation that was inseparable from revolutionary principles, that could not be divorced from the political and philosophical context that had created it. In the end, the question of what to do with the captured stallion became symbolic of larger questions about the nature of the revolutionary struggle, about the relationship between conventional military power and innovative tactical thinking, about the ultimate meaning of victory in a conflict that had produced such unprecedented developments. The horse's presence in federal custody served as a constant reminder that revolutionary forces had achieved something that went beyond simple military resistance, had created new forms of collaboration and understanding that challenged fundamental assumptions about intelligence, loyalty, and the nature of warfare itself. Now, if you've made it this far in this incredible story, make sure to hit that like button and share this with anyone who loves tales of extraordinary partnerships between humans and animals. There's still more to this amazing story, so don't go anywhere. The conclusion will leave you speechless about the ultimate fate of this legendary stallion and the revolutionary who trained him to think like a general.